Sending a teenage daughter off for marriage was a common practice amongst royals in history. But one case of this would leave the father with much regret, enough that the result may have influenced his treatment of future daughters. Today, we cover the short life of a young girl, a king's daughter who met a brutal end and acted as a warning to England as to what was to come. This is Joan of England, and this is her tragic HERstory.
Once upon a time in history.
Before we begin the life of Joan, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Leah Toole. Leah is a fantastic writer of Tudor fiction, and she has just released her 5th book and her first alternative history novel. What if Arthur Tudor had never died and Henry VIII had never ruled? Leah conjures up a riveting tale to answer this question, and you can buy your copy on Amazon. Now, time for Joan. Ring around the roses. The 14th century. The darkest century. The century of throne games, mini ice age, famine, succession chaos, and disease. This is the century when Joan of England, also known as Joanna, was born comfortably in the luxuries as daughter of the king. Precisely when she was born is not certain, with the dates of the 19th of December 1333 and 28th of January 1334 usually used, but she may have been born as late as 1335. Her birthplace is also uncertain, with the Tower of London listed as one of the possible locations, but with Woodstock Palace being another, as it was a favourite to the Queen and would become the birthplace for multiple of Joan's siblings. Joan was the 3rd child of King Edward III and his wife Philippa of Hainault, making her the little sister to the century's most infamous knight, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. She grew up in the royal nursery as part of the household of the Earl of Pembroke and under the care of the Countess of Pembroke, Margaret de St. Pol. Her playmates would be her 2 elder siblings, Edward and Isabella, and her cousin Joan of Kent. A number of other noble children were in the royal nursery, allowing for friendships, alliances, and perhaps even rivalries to begin before the children entered adulthood and politics. In the weeks following her birth, Joan and her 2 elder siblings joined their mother in travelling the country. Edward III was on a military campaign at this time, so it's likely they were following the army. Records show that in her life, Joan would have her own household, in part shared with her sister Isabella, which included an esquire, damsels, pages, and tailors. This is considered an unusual arrangement, as typically girls so young shared the household of their mother or their guardian. A pocket full of posies. In 1338, Edward III began marriage arrangements for Joan and would take her with him to Koblenz, a seat of the Holy Roman Empire. There, they would discuss Joan's potential marriage to the son of Otto the Merry, Duke of Austria. His son was the 10-year-old Frederick. She remained in Munich at the court of Ludwig IV for 1 to 2 years, under the guardianship of his wife and Joan's maternal aunt, Margaret of Hainault, where she was to be educated. The full details of the marriage plans for Joan aren't entirely clear. There's a possibility that a marriage between Joan and one of Margaret's sons was also considered. Due to the degrees of relation, as this would have been a first cousin marriage, it would have required papal dispensations and had a high chance of the dismissal on the grounds of consanguinity. Joan would not have an enjoyable time under her aunt's care. It would be brought to Philippa's attention that Joan was chronically neglected. Margaret of Hainault didn't simply fail in the form of clothing, but also in feeding the child. While it's unlikely Joan was starving in rags, she wasn't being kept to the standard required. Disgusted, Philippa demanded Edward III order for the retrieval of their daughter. In April of 1340, The estrangency between mother and child came to an end, and now 6-year-old Joan was to be reunited with her mother in Ghent. There, she would also meet the newest addition to the royal nursery, a brother who would be known as Joan of Gaunt. From there, they followed Edward to the Low Countries for the war with France. Once returned to England, Joan would be reunited with her sister Isabella, and they would share households as previously mentioned. It's assumed the sisters had a good relationship, or at least amicable enough that they would be able to share a bed. After her ordeal under Margaret of Hainault, Joan must have well appreciated how her parents spoiled her sister and herself. It is recorded that Philippa of Hainault sent robes trimmed with fur, silk stockings and fine dresses to her daughters. While needlework is common, purchases suggest that Joan had quite a passion for it. A tissue, a tissue. In 1345, Joan was betrothed to Alfonso XI of Castile and Leon's son, Pedro. Joan would likely be introduced to her husband via passed-on words of his person. She would have been told how the 11-year-old king-to-be was of fair complexion, fair-haired and light-eyed, and was becoming accustomed to hard work and enjoyed music and poetry. Joan may have counted herself lucky, not simply that this marriage came with the promise of being a queen consort like her mother, but also that her marriage was to be with someone of a similar age to herself. But, meanwhile, a pestilence was reaching Europe. It had first appeared in southwest China in the early 1330s. From there, it had clawed its way through Asia and the Mediterranean, leaving devastation, paranoia and confusion in its wake. It turned the fittest warrior, the greatest man, to a mutilated corpse in mere days. He walked, ran, fought, and then, so suddenly, he was no more. What enraged God or the gods so? Was it lack of modesty, greed? Was it the devil or demons? Was this great suffering to purge the world of sins? Was it a warning, but if so, of what? And how could it be stopped? Was isolation enough? Closed doors and windows lived like an anchoress? Were prayers even heard? Now, just over a decade later, it was roaring into Constantinople, and word would make way to England, though likely there was still much ignorance. And for all the precautions Edward III would take, there would be little or none towards the horror that was engulfing the world. To Edward's knowledge, the devastation wasn't happening anywhere near where Joan was going. There was no reason to fear. And so it was that in 1348, 14-year-old Joan would begin her journey to her new kingdom. Farewells would be emotional, as when women left to marry in another country, it was better to assume they'd never see them face to face again. Edward assured his daughter would feel safe in her travels. She came with her own household, those within carefully selected to please Joan and to impress the Castilian court. Her trousseau was so large they required a ship of their own. The rest of the ships were compiled of a great army for the ladies' protection and security. It is said Joan left England feeling quite safe and likely well loved, for this grand fleet was not just Edward III protecting his trade for alliance, but also his daughter. They all fell down. The fleet reached Bordeaux in the summer of 1348. Still, they needed to make their way to Bayonne, where the wedding was to take place on the 1st of November. For now, they would settle in the royal family castle and enjoy sleeping without the rocking of the boat. The mayor of Bordeaux was quick to warn Joan's retinue of the plague, for it had already reached them and the breakout had begun. But it seems the danger didn't register, and they continued with their plan to stay in Bordeaux for respite. Perhaps if they had heeded the warning and moved, even better, returned to England, all would have been fine. Or perhaps doom hit them as soon as they stepped onto Bordeaux's terra firma and any warning was too late. Within days, those around Joan began to drop like flies. It is said that when the leader of the retinue, Robert Bouchier, passed away on the 20th of August, terror finally hit Joan like lightning, and the young girl feared for her life. At last, it was decided they would relocate her to Hainault, a small village, but it was already too late. She would be the first to be taken by the pestilence, and it is said it took her violently. We don't know when Joan's symptoms started, but it was likely between the 25th and the 31st of August. How she suffered, we don't know precisely. But for all who fell, the symptoms could include vomiting, diarrhea, fever and chills, swollen lymph nodes at the neck, armpits and groin, and the most infamous sign of the Black Death, the blackening of the skin. Joan died in Hainault on the 2nd of September 1348. She was just 14 years old. Her parents, bereft and regretful at the loss of their daughter, sent envoys to retrieve her body to no avail. It is unknown where Joan is buried. Some think it may be in Hainault, others in Bayonne Cathedral, now unmarked. Another tale tells us that her remains were burnt in her bed so no one would be burdened with having to have contact with the infected remains. And some think all this untrue, that she in fact died much earlier in Bordeaux. Perhaps the story was extended to create an excuse in the delay in notifying her family. Edward III would write a letter to Alfonso XI. In this letter, he says this of his daughter: "But see, with what intense bitterness of heart we have to tell you this. Destructive death, who seizes young and old alike, sparing no one and reducing rich and poor to the same level, has lamentably snatched from both of us our dearest daughter, whom we loved best of all, as her virtues demanded. No fellow human being could be surprised if we were inwardly desolated by the sting of this bitter grief, for we are humans too. But we, who have placed our trust in God and our life between His hands, where He has held it closely through many great dangers, we give thanks to Him that one of our own family, free of all stain, whom we have loved with our life, has been sent ahead to heaven to reign among the choirs of virgins, where she can gladly intercede for our offences before God Himself." Marriages of future children were treated quite differently by Edward III, and it is thought that this was with Joan in mind. Her siblings had more say. A sister cancelled a wedding. Her brother chose his bride. It seems a lesson was learned, but we can be saddened that it was not inherited by the following generations. Thank you for taking the time to learn the life of Joan of England, and if you would like to hear more her stories, the lives of women from history, you should subscribe and drop me a like and even a comment. It all helps the channel. Thank you so much. I will see you in another time in history.